When I left our cabin, the twin cabins, the river probably was 4 feet under the bank out there from, the top of the bank. When I came back, it was about 2 feet from the top of that bank. And I said, let's take our fur and get out of here. I said, I'm afraid that river's going to get this wet. Oh, it never has. Never has. Well, gee whiz, he lived here much longer than I had. And, well, I took his word for it. Went to bed, and I woke up and, boy, I had a funny feeling. Something's wrong here. I reached my hand over the edge of that bed, and there was the water. There was the water.
Leaving North Bend, the Snoqualmie River is hidden from sight, but there is a hint to the beauty beyond the houses, malls, and warehouses. Paved roads and concrete bridges give easy passage across rivers, meadows, and forests that just a few years ago challenged travelers on our path. There are hints even here of a beauty, a wildness, a heritage. Today we will divert from the heavily traveled I-90 just as it separates into the valley carved by the South Fork of the Snoqualmie River. Our destination, instead, is in the Middle Fork, the deeply forested valley just beyond the escarpments of the ridge connecting Mount Si to Mount Tenerife. Leaving I-90 at exit 34, we pass between the historic town sites of Tanner and Edgewick. The Middle Fork Road turns to gravel 2 miles later, and the sounds of water are all around us. We enter the valley where Herb Ray woke on that night in the 1920s to find water all around his bed. This is where we will spend the day, discovering the dreams along the river before the waters flow along Mount Si to North Bend. The Middle Fork Trail travels where the North Bend Timber Company used steam railroads to log the old-growth forests. Sometimes it's hard to tell, amongst the deep second-growth trees fed by over 100 inches of annual rain, but the signs are the distinctive stumps, with springboard notches still visible after all these years. North Bend Timber's rail lines ran from Tanner and Edgewick, up through the Middle Fork where men logged to Goldmeyer Hot Springs, and up the tributary Pratt Valley. Logging extended up from the tracks using steam donkeys, and loggers willing to work in any condition. The patterns in the modern forest give testimony to the reach of their crosscut saws and skidder cables. More than a story of a few men, this is the story of people and families who struggled to make a living through the Great Depression and produced the lumber that built North Bend and Seattle.
Well, we had the big unit and 2 coal deck machines. On that unit, there's usually about 12-man crew, and I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's about 8 men on those coal deck machines.
Even with the coal deck alongside of a track, the track machine, like the unit, we'd call that a cat machine, track machine, he'd only go up 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 foot from the track. Then you have a coal deck there, he could go up another 1,200, 1,400 foot, and that was the end of it. If there was more timber that way, how are you going to get him if you didn't pull him down with a cat? So you might say that half a mile is probably all that they could reach from a track.
Although only a boy at the time, John Weeks lived through the 1918 flood of North Bend Timber's company town of Edgewick.
You know what how they got the name Edgewick? Vintage and Weeks. Edge Weeks, that didn't sound right. So they called it Edgewick. A little ways past North Bend, there was a church and a store and a post office, and that's where they built their sawmill up in there. Then during World War I, you see, there was a great demand for the products they were cutting there, rough lumber mostly. And on Christmas Eve of 1918, the city had raised the dam to raise the water behind the dam, Chester Morris Lake they call it now. And it didn't hold water. It seeped all around, and that's why there's a place below it called Rattlesnake Lake. They had to condemn all the land there because water flooded the little town that was there. This water broke out on the side of, not the dam didn't break, but the side of the hill did, and it came roaring down this creek called Boxley Canyon Creek. They now call it Christmas Creek. And it wiped out the sawmill. But you see, the place was shut down, and the night watchman saw the water coming up rapidly in the pond, and he blew the fire whistle. And everybody got out and got to high ground, and it just wrecked all the buildings. It was a company town. And that was the end of that site. They couldn't do any more there, so they just logged after that.
We weren't getting any money. $2.70 a day for chokermen. A day there in the rain and the snow, and they hauled us to Camp Brown on the speeder, and then we had to ride on an open log cart out to the sides. Quite a grade up that Pratt. And the railroad went up there, and then they had a long run out. I said it was a switchback, it was a kickback. Well, say that the engine was pushing these cars up the hills. Well, they'd go out on this long run out, they pulled them up there, so they could push them up the other way and leave them, see? That's right under Preacher Mountain.
They got all this doggone alder growing along. And the darn alder leaves getting on the track, and it's just like grease. A Shea locomotive was the popular one. The boiler isn't straight in the middle. It's set over to the left-hand side a little bit. And right in front of the engineer is a 3-cylinder engine. This shaft that's being turned by these 3-cylinder engine and has on it the gear. It connects to a big gear that's on the wheel. So all the wheels of the locomotive, including the tender behind it, have power to them. And so their maximum speed is about 25 miles an hour. And when you're going 10 miles an hour, it sounds like they're going 100. They're terribly powerful.
That's the only way they could survive. The market wouldn't buy naughty timber. There's too much good stuff. They thought they're never going to run out of it.
My name's Dick Kirby, and I went to work at the U.S. Forest Service in 1965. I was in college, and the day I came to work, they sent me to fire school. And because I had the worst car when we came back from fire school, I ended up going into the Middle Fork to Camp Brown, and the person that had the nice car went to Humphrey Lookout. The Middle Fork Road was so bad that they didn't want this kid from Georgia to have to drive his car. There were constant accidents in the Middle Fork. People were flat tires, where I actually quit the Forest Service one time and went home because I'd had 4 or 5 flat tires in 2 days. And so I went home and I said, I'm not coming back. I just can't afford, my car's getting beat up. It was already beat up, but so that was the start of having a truck. And I had a truck for years, and then when I drove in and out, I had a government truck. And the Middle Fork has so much to do. There's so many kinds of adventures. Now people are, the road's better. People can get to their destination faster and probably want to get where they're going in a little more of a hurry than they used to. Up Quartz Creek was Martin Nordstrom's cabin, and it was still standing in '65. And it was a log cabin, and now about all that's left is the old potato cellar. I see that still there, and a lot of the fence line is still there, cedar fence posts. Going up the Middle Fork, Al Moore had a cabin on his property just about a mile above Taylor River Campgrounds. That still existed. Several times Cougar Pete, I don't remember where he was. I think he was in some kind of assisted living, and whenever he could, he would sneak out and come up to Al Moore's cabin in the Middle Fork. And so I could barely lift his pack into the back of my truck, but I would haul Cougar Pete into North Bend, into the ranger station. CCC Road, originally, I think it was supposed to go all the way to Highway 2. The CCC guys started from North Bend and came into the Middle Fork. Other people lived at Camp Brown, and they went from this direction, and they built road. And there was, let's see, I don't remember the year, but there was a tremendous washout on this far end, and that was pretty much what ended the CCC road, and the Forest Service decided, much to my dismay, that they would close that road. So kind of a sad time, because it really is a spectacular road, and I'm sure it will be a spectacular trail.
And when we were working up near the hot springs at Spur 8, the fellow that ran the hot springs, and his sister still does own it, I guess, was a fellow named Bill Morrow. And he wanted to bring his people, his guests, up and down on the speeder. But gee, they came and they just took up too much room. And so Uncle Webb said, no, you can ride, but we can't haul them. So they'd have to hike in over the Snow Lake Trail. And so Bill would ride, and he'd come up to where the landing was from the hot springs, which wasn't very far. I'd wait till the train was ready to go, or the speeder. He was sitting on a stump up there when a line, the side washed around a stump, and it slipped up over it, and it got him in the leg, broke his leg.
Hi.
Hi there.
Hi. Welcome to Goldmeyer.
Thank you.
How was the hike in?
Wonderful.
Great.
Good.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah,
Wet.
what's your name?
Well, I'm Beth Berman, and I've been coming to Goldmeyer since the early 70s. We don't know all the details about William Goldmeyer. He was an original pioneer settler in Sand Point in Seattle. He was perhaps kind of a eccentric or odd kind of man that just wanted to disappear into the forest. He loved hiking, he loved prospecting, he just, liked to be out. Back then, you could stake it out and you had to do $500 worth of improvements. And so he blasted open this cave that's up here. This cave goes 30 feet back into bedrock. And I think he put a value of about, what was it, $50 or something on that. And then he built his lodge. And between what he did here, he accomplished the $500 required investment into it. And I believe it was 1917, he achieved the actual patented mining claim or ownership of the property. Of course, this was really far out back then, with no road, no railroad. You would have had to, to have a mule train or hike the whole way up from North Bend, which is, 25 miles. So it was really remote in Goldmeyer's era. And then the Morrow family purchased it from the railroad in the late 20s. And they had a lot of ideas. Bill, my understanding is he was a real high energy man, and he of course worked as much as he could through the Depression era. But even after working a full day, he would come up here to Goldmeyer. And they had a mule called Eagle. They put as much as they could on Eagle, but some things Eagle couldn't even carry, and so Bill just said we want it up there, so he strapped it on his back to get it up here. I think he was a pretty amazing man. There were all kinds of different ideas, including a really grandiose plan of turning this into a grand hotel with fountains and, drive-up access and gourmet meals, which also was probably, kind of unrealistic for the remote location. So I think, the Morrows, just like the Goldmeyers, perhaps realized that they were just really limited as to what they could do up here because it's so remote. I think it must have been really nice back in Goldmeyer in the Morrows era when there were wooden cedar log tubs here to soak in. But then that era in between when the Morrows could manage the place and when Northwest Wilderness programs began developing it to the point where we have it now, there was really an era where it went kind of in abuse and disuse and overuse. Vita Morrow Metcalf decided to turn it into a conservation area. And she was really the founder of what we see here today. Perhaps this is the culmination of the dream at Goldmeyer. It's gone through a lot of different phases, and maybe this is the realistic one. Just let nature have it, and people are visitors, rather than trying to develop it or turn it into something really grandiose.
Leaving Goldmeyer Hot Springs, our trail starts to gain more altitude. Dreams of riches brought prospectors and miners here throughout the 20th century looking for copper and gold beneath the Snoqualmie granite. We make a brief stop at the site of the Anaconda copper mine where ore was extracted during the 50s and 60s, but our final stop is further up the valley. It was here, where the trees get shorter and the valley takes on a more alpine nature, that Andrew Jackson Dutch Miller traveled in early 1896. Clearing the deeper forests, Dutch Miller approached Williams Lake, prospecting for the minerals hinted to by stories and legends. This was only the start, and he proceeded up, away from the gap later named for him, towards the remote Chain and LeBon lakes. Here he staked his claim. The economics of the late 1890s were perfect for copper. The proliferation of electric power systems demanded tons of it. Later assays would find the Dutch Miller found some of the richest copper ever discovered in North America. He also found some of the most remote. By 1901, the Dutch Miller Mining and Smelting Company was working the claim. During the next 4 years, 3 adits, horizontal mine tunnels, and 2 shafts, vertical tunnels, would be cut into the vein and over 150 tons of high-grade copper ore removed. But how to get it to market? 40 miles from North Bend, or 5,000 feet above sea level, and covered with snow 8 to 9 months of the year, the Seattle-Boston Copper Company faced quite a challenge. 3 possible approaches were considered, but ultimately the first and only serious attempt to access the mine was through the Foss River Valley to the north. An article in a 1906 edition of the Westerner fills in the plan.
At mill site, which is proposed to name Skyboat, the company will lay out its town site and terminals for the railroad and tram. This tram is to be 4 miles and 2,300 feet in length. This tram will have an ultimate capacity of 500 tons per day.
For whatever reason, the railroad grade was built, cabins were put in, and stocks were sold, but by 1906, the enterprise was not complete, and the ore still lay at the shores of Chain Lakes. In 1941, a proposal for a United States government-funded mine-to-market road in the Middle Fork Valley spawned new interest. Geologists were dispatched and reaffirmed the high quality and abundant copper ore. A later picture, from the 1950s, seems to show the same geologist evaluating the mine once again. The road was funded, but never built, and the ore stayed in place. As late as 1972, the Seattle Times reported a scheme to use snow track vehicles to bring the ore out in the winter. More sensitive to these beautiful alpine meadows, in 1976 the area was protected when it became a part of the newly created Alpine Lakes Wilderness. The riches in the Middle Fork, we realized, are not below the surface.
It's my heart and soul. I grew up here, and it was my exploration playground, as a young adult, and still is today. And when I need to be grounded, when I need inspiration, when I need to go to my church, I come to the Middle Fork Valley.
You look outside into the rain. You watch the children play.
Off the first excursion train on the 4th of July of 1889 at Snoqualmie Falls and walked up into the pass and staked out his claim, built a cabin, and we have pictures of that.
Yeah, the years went by. North Bend was a real big logging outfit. Then they went up the Middle Fork and up to Camp Brown.
Have you ever been up to that Middle Fork?
Well, I have been up to Middle Fork, but I've never been up to Taylor River.
Oh, you haven't? Well, then you haven't been up to the Middle Fork.
I wish you well. Don't forget to call. Take Take it easy, but take it all. I wish you well. Don't forget to call. Take it easy, but take it.
So he's traveling all these places around the world. We got married up here. It was a real small wedding. Tried to stay within the rules of the organization, and it's a wedding. I think it's my favorite wedding I've ever been to. Oh, you put it right over the gully. And that's the bee can. We're at LeBon Gap. LeBon Gap is the very start of the Middle Fork. We're about 43 miles from where the Three Rivers confluence is. And it feels kind of good. We just finished filming at Dutch Miller. That was the last part of the filming.
Hi, my name is Brad Allen.
And I'm Zach Allen, and together we produced this film.
We appreciate you taking the time to watch Dreams in the Wilderness, Stories from the Middle Fork. This was an enjoyable project for both of us, and originally started as Project Sandshed. And the origins of this film is kind of interesting. We originally went into the Middle Fork looking for old growth trees. And as we were searching for those, it occurred to us that it might make sense to understand where the logging occurred. And that got us going into researching some history in the Middle Fork. And we found a report called the Pratt Valley Logging Camp Archaeological Report. And it talked about an area where they had a maintenance shack and a shed where they kept sand that they would use to put on the rails for the Shea engines that the North Bend Timber Company used. And that got us interested in what we were looking for. Originally, we were going to call this the History of the Middle Fork, but we realized that the history of the Middle Fork was so large, the best we could do was tell a few stories. So we focused on these few stories that occurred in the early 1900s, and we tried to get that in the context of the valley. The nice thing is the Middle Fork Valley is so accessible to Seattle that you can get out there on a weekend almost year round. And you can hike out into the valley and you can run into these bits of history.
This movie has a lot of historical photos, and so that was kind of my dad's job, was to restore the photos and make them HD quality, and then my job was to take the photos and put them in with the video and mix it all together into the movie. And we did it all right here on a home computer using the Adobe editing systems, and I learned most of my stuff at my video productions class at Mount Si High School, where I'm a sophomore right now.
One of our biggest challenges during the filming was that in the January prior, the Middle Fork was hit real hard with flooding, and it washed out the road in several areas. Early on during the research, I actually had to bike up into to even get to the trailheads, and I would bike 7 to 10 miles before I would start hiking. Later on, we were able to move a little bit further in. The Forest Service eventually opened the road to the Middle Fork trailhead. But even then, it was over 10 miles to get to Goldmire. And during the trip where we went up and filmed the Dutch Miller Mine, we did 32 miles that weekend and went all the way up the Middle Fork and did cross country through the top of the near Lobon Gap and came out the Necklace Valley and out to through the Foss River onto Highway 2. So we did an incredible amount of hiking. We enjoyed that immensely, and it was probably the highlight of the trip was working with all the different people we worked with to make that happen. We really appreciated the grant from King County. It allowed us to do a number of things. It allowed us to do a lot more operations up in the Middle Fork than we originally thought we could, and to bring in the hikers and support them throughout, and to do some of the special film technique. I think one of the biggest challenges was getting hikers. And I thought I had a group lined up, and a week before our big filming weekend, they all dropped out. And I literally had no one lined up 6 days before the hike. And I was at a picnic for work and was telling the story there at a picnic table. And two guys, Phil, who was somebody I knew, he jumped in and said he would go. And then the other one was Damon, who I met Damon at the table. He said he'd like to do it and then told me who he was. And completely without knowing us, he went off on that 3-day adventure in the rain and the hiking and the filming at Goldmire. And it was pretty amazing and came out with some great footage. When the actual film time came in August and September, we hiked about 50 miles total. And we spent 8 days out in the valley filming, and during that time we slept 6 nights in a number of locations. The first set, which was on the Labor Day weekend, we estimate that we got somewhere between 4 and 6 inches of rain during the 3 days we were out there filming.
We had ideas like we were gonna fly the camera through a forest with we wanted to fly it up a tree with a helicopter and balloons. And the one that we were more serious about, we called the A-cam, and originally was for aerial cam. But so this one, our idea was that it would just fly horizontally along the forest and film the forest floor or around the forest. And so my dad talked to a friend of ours, Dave Hunt, who designed a carriage that went along cables that you could hook to the trees. And so we got that done, we tested it, and it worked. And so we went to our first shoot, which it wasn't hard to get to, but it wasn't exactly convenient. We were able to do it pretty good, but the first shots, not a lot of them made it into the final cut because of focus issues, or my dad and Dave in the background pulling the strings, pulling the cable along. So, but in the end, it was I think it adds a lot to the video.
I think our frustrations came out a number of times. It does seem like the editing brought them together, but even out in the filming once or twice, setting up cameras and setting up cables.
Yeah.
Okay, action! Give it a push, Dad.
Yeah, okay.
Pushed us a little bit towards the end. But in the end, I actually think that some of those those creative differences helped. I mean, one of the things I think of is that on the architectural plan for the Goldmeyer Resort, that finally I got mad enough that I left the room, and an hour later you produced that great sequence that shows all the different transitions, and I think that's one of the best sequences that you put together. And so it worked.
Yeah.
Here, hold on. You hang up, you pull down just a little bit on it.
So one of our visions was this shot going up the tree. And originally we called that the B-cam for balloon camera, but it turns out balloons were a little bit less practical than we thought. If nothing else, trying to get an 80-pound helium tank out into the forest was a logistical issue. So we ended up with actually a modification of Dave's A-cam that we called the B-cam, that involved using slingshots to shoot strings, and then we used up into the trees, and then we pulled the strings through, used those to pull a series of ropes until we basically had a W kind of up about 80 feet up into 2 trees. We used that to pull a couple of steel cables, which were guides for the camera. It turns out the camera rotated a lot, and it took us, out of all the filming, I think we had about 20 minutes of material that we cut down to the 30 seconds you see in the opening credits. But I think it met the vision we were trying to capture there, and that was something that felt good. What happened with anything like that, you begin to get comfortable with people, spend a little bit of time in the wilderness. We got a little silly at times, but in the end, that's what made it fun. So it was a good time out filming it, and I think it was well worth it to bring that all together. I think one of the other things that I learned is there's a lot more to history, and it's much more complex, and it's hard to get really what the facts were.
And you have to be careful because it involves a lot of people. So you got to make sure everybody is okay with it or likes it, or the information is correct or as correct as possible.
Right. I think that's important, and I think it was important. One of our goals was to honor the people in the history, and it's easy to turn history into a scandal. And we wanted to honor some people who worked hard and whose relatives still live in that area, and who really did do some great things for building a great community. So we'd like to thank you for watching Dreams in the Wilderness. We hope you enjoyed it. For us, Project Sandshed was a very interesting project, and we learned a lot about the history of the Snoqualmie Valley.
I get the feeling that we've filmed the whole valley, don't you?
Yeah. The whole way, almost the whole Middle Fork Trail.
But this is it. It's where it all begins
and
and ends.